Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. We've got an incredible guest today, and I'm really excited for the insights and ideas they'll be sharing. There are so many practical learnings from the conversation that will make a difference to you, your team, or organization. If your organization is interested in a workshop on this topic of the podcast, feel free to get in touch via our website, yellowwood.ie. If you want to support our podcast, and you'll find a link to our Patreon in the podcast description. Thanks in advance for listening and your support. Now, let's take a different path to success. Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. Joining us today to discuss her book, You're the Boss, Become the Manager You Want to Be and Others Need. And joining us is the author of this book, Sabina Nawaz, an elite executive coach who advises C-level executives and teams at Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, nonprofits, and academic institutions around the world. Sabina routinely gives speeches each year and teaches faculty at Northeastern and Drexel universities. During her 14-year tenure at Microsoft, she went from managing software development teams to leading the company's executive development and succession planning efforts for over 11,000 managers and nearly 1,000 executives, advising Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer directly. She has written for and been featured in Harvard Business Review, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Fast Company, NASDAQ, NBC, and MarketWatch. Sabina, welcome to the Workplace Podcast.
Thank you so much, William. Looking forward to our discussion.
So let me start with high praise for this book. So Adam Grant says you offer sage advice. Rita McGrath is quoted as saying this book will help managers eliminate their dysfunctional behaviors and learn to turn them into superpowers. And Marshall Goldsmith says this is a powerful guide to navigate the pressures of authority and pitfalls of power. Now, Sabina, this is a really good book. And what I like about this book are the references to my former educators that we just spoke about just before we started recording here, about Bob Keegan and Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky, who was a podcast guest. So we'll talk about their work later on, along with Lisa Lahey. Again, the coaching questions are really good in each of the chapters, and the array of tools that you have, like the delegation dial, the hunger tracker, the mapping tool, the time portfolio. Especially, I like at the very end of the book, if you buy this book, there's 42 different questions as a 360 tool. That is amazing for our listeners there to check that out. And I really was interested in your direct dealings with Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. I thought that was really cool. And it's great to get that insight. And other insights I found it really good, and I'll stop my praise shortly, were the power gaps and the pressure handling, because we behave differently once we become managers, and you talk about that. And what I found really fascinating was breaking family patterns and also over functioning managers. So we'll talk all about this in the podcast. And what I really like then, Sabina, and I leave it at this, you reveal so much about yourself that it really makes it accessible, and it normalizes the challenges managers have. So I have to give this full praise. So anybody who's tuning in, this is crucial reading for you if you're struggling with the pressures of management. So the transition to management, Sabina, is tough. And sometimes as a manager, I might be wondering, where do I add value now that I've moved from a technical role maybe to a management role? And I might get stuck into maybe a scarcity mindset. Where do I add the value?
Where do I add value once I've become a manager? I'm
Yeah.
used to being this individual contributor where my work is more concrete. People can measure the results. I get rewarded for that. And suddenly, yes. And before even adding value, I think one of the mistakes we make is jumping in and continuing to do what we've always done. Of course, the problem with that is not just that you're not doing your own job, you're doing someone else's job. You're also crippling the growth, development, and potential of the people who work for you. Recognizing where you add value is recognizing and preparing yourself for a mindset shift, because it is no longer about you. So if you think about work being done in a container and you're putting in all this content into that container, Your job is no longer the content, as one of my clients told me a long time ago when he had this epiphany. Your job is the container. How do I shape how we get that work done? What sorts of principles, what sorts of norms, what's the culture, what kind of results? How do we measure success? How do we recognize success? How do we hold people accountable? How do people hold each other accountable? Those are the kinds of ways in which managers are going to add value. It's challenging because, especially initially, it's hard to see how that's going to get you rewarded, how that's going to get you noticed. And we all struggle with that. We all want to be seen, heard, and loved. We all want to be recognized. So suddenly it's saying, wait a minute, do I remove myself from the limelight? And especially, I didn't get here being a shrinking violet. I got here being noticed, being recognized, having tangible results to prove. So part of this is recognizing what are some of our inner hungers, our inner desires that might get in the way of stepping away and allowing the team to do the work of the content while I hold the container. And then when I say inner hungers and desires, I mean things like very human needs, like wanting to be seen as the smartest person in the room, perhaps wanting to be recognized as a martyr or as the hero who comes in, or a savior who comes in and saves everybody with their cape billowing. Now, these are really, they don't sound great, but we all have these desires as human beings. So recognizing you're human, that you might have one of these unmet hungers. And just like when you go to the grocery store hungry, you buy junk food, you're going to indulge in junk behaviors if you show up to work hungry.
Yeah, and we'll talk about those junk behaviors later because I think that's kind of leading us to toxic behaviors. But if we go into that, then there's something changes then when you become a manager. There's these hidden power dynamics there, aren't there?
Absolutely. The minute power walks into the room, it shifts, it shape shifts the room itself. It changes the dynamics in the room. No matter how friendly you might be, how approachable you might be, you come with a title. And that title means you have control over people's destiny in small and big ways. What they get to work on today, whether they get to work tomorrow, is all within your purview, within your role. So it changes how people look at you, how people respond to you. One of the CEOs I coach, we were talking on the eve of his being formally named the CEO, and he said, "You know, Sabina, tomorrow I'm going to be really funny." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "My jokes are kind of lame. I know that. My kids call them dad jokes. But tomorrow, everybody's going to say my jokes are the funniest jokes around because I've become CEO." So
So
the
that
power
dynamic.
gap is that distance. It's that distance. And if we leave it on, and don't get me wrong, some of that distance is healthy and good because you do need to recognize you have a different set of responsibilities. You have a different role you're playing, and there is a gap there. But when untended, that gap leads to missed opportunities, to misunderstanding, miscommunication, and poor morale and productivity ultimately.
As I was reading the book and you mentioned dad jokes there, it reminded me of the adaptive leadership work of Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky and the role of an authority figure in management. There is that connection there, doesn't it? There's a shift there. Can you just tell us about that?
Yes. So we all have, and I mean, this goes through adaptive leadership, it goes through basic psychology. We all have relationships with people in positions of authority. A lot of that gets started when we're infants. And hopefully, our parents, if we had parents or whoever took care of us, tend to us and care for us. Sometimes they abuse that and don't do that. So we form attachments and relationships and detachments to authority right from childhood. So when you reach a position of authority, people bring all of that baggage with them. There are so many jokes and memes and terms about bad bosses. they're not just there because you or I showed up as a quote unquote bad boss. It might be because I'm interpreting what you're doing in that position of authority differently. It might be that I'm projecting my baggage around authority onto you. Because one of the myths that I bust in the book is there is no such thing as a purely bad or a purely good boss. They all reside within us. It's bad boss behaviors forged under pressure.
And that's what I like about this book. Then you talk about breaking those family patterns there, because sometimes our leadership is influenced by, well, who are our first leadership figures or authority figures or our teachers or our parents there, uh, and that's really an interesting insight that a family dynamic or family pattern can play out in the workplace many years later.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So just on that, what is it? What insights on those family dynamics could you tell our listeners there? What's important for them to understand about those family dynamics? What might be, if I'm a manager listening, kind of going, I didn't realize that at all. How might I recognize that in myself?
If you go to the chapter on hunger tracker, it shows you behaviorally what might be happening.
Mm,
I'm not a psychologist, and you could go to therapy
yeah,
to also identify some of these things. And my recommendation would be think about what are the things you're doing that get in the way of some other things you want to do. So, for example, let's say you want to delegate.
yeah,
But what you're doing instead, and this is where the hunger tracker will come in use because you'll be able to pinpoint the exact behaviors. You're the first one to jump in onto an email thread and respond, even though you have supposedly delegated that piece to somebody on your team.
mm,
You jump in with excessive amounts of comments, some things that are not really necessary at that level of detail. You redo the work once they submit it to you. So you do all these things that are counter to you delegating. Now you could stop there and say, "Oh, I'm just going to do the opposite of those things." And that's not really going to work. You've tried that, it doesn't work.
yeah,
And this is based on Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy's work on immunity to
yeah,
change. Instead, what you want to do is look under the covers and say, what are some of those hungers that might be driving my jump to that? One example of this is a client of mine who is 58 years old, and he does this. This is his
yeah,
pattern, and he hasn't been able to shake it. But what he started realizing when he looked at this deeper is we sometimes call the 50s the youth of old age.
mm,
And he realizes that his corporate mortality, if you will, is limited. That timer is going to go off. And he
yeah,
doesn't want to let go. So that not wanting to let go is causing these behaviors. And if you look at that from the lens of how he has been conditioned since childhood, there's something about being, in his case, the oldest child and not wanting to cede the limelight and control, if you will, to his
yeah,
younger siblings, of which there were six. So
yeah,
again, we don't go into therapy in our conversations. We're looking at the
yeah,
patterns here and what are the unmet
yeah.
hungers and how to recognize that. So the first step is recognizing what is it that I'm doing that's counter to what I say I want, and not just do the opposite, but dig further to say what else might be going on.
And that's what I like about the book then, because you talk about that scarcity mindset that we go into that competing mode and
Yes,
competing with my siblings. And then that's why I might be kind of going, I know the answer, or I'm going to get in there first. And it's these needs that we have, or hungers that you say in the book. And
yes,
that's where understanding then you talk about those junk behaviors or toxic behaviors. So if I want to enhance my self-awareness, then what might those toxic behaviors be? There's a power gap distortion, isn't there?
absolutely. There are some obvious toxic behaviors, and we're not talking about those. Those are so obvious that
Yeah,
hopefully you recognize it yourself. The next morning you go, oh
yeah,
gosh, I shouldn't have had that
yeah,
fit of anger and raised my voice. The toxic behaviors that are most insidious and most harmful hide under the guise of nobility. And we tell ourselves these, what I call, yeah, but stories. Yeah, but I'm doing that for their own good. Yeah, but they're really busy, so they cannot take it on. If you use too many yeah buts, it's a flag that you're doing things that you shouldn't be doing. So that's the first early indication. What's your yeah but count? The other thought is one of the power gaps is called the gap of the sole provider. And the sole provider, actually, it's a pressure gap, but it resides in power as well, which is I'm going to caretake my people without them having asked to be caretaken, by the way, or I can just do it faster than them. So I'm the only one who should jump in and do it, or I'm going to do it better than them, the straight A student, or the whack-a-mole champ, which is this arcade game where you whack all these moles that pop up with a rubber mallet. This is the people who write an item on their to-do list that has already been completed just so that they can scratch it off, myself included. So we fall into this sole provider trap as I am the only one. And that in itself is a toxic behavior. It's toxic not just to your own pressure that you create on yourself, your own well-being, but it completely stunts the opportunities, the visibility, the growth, the development, and the work that other people can do. It's
And
back to
that's
in your search for value, you're barking up the wrong value trees.
and that's where you go back to the work of Keegan and Lahey then when it comes to those shadow motivations or those competing commitments, isn't it? We're getting our need met from some way, but it's actually we should be doing something else. Isn't that right?
Exactly, exactly.
There are pitfalls or there's pressures that happen then. What are the pitfalls that we as managers fall into then?
Yeah, so many. I mean, the getting in, jumping in, doing it ourselves. We
Yeah.
also sometimes lose track of the big picture. Why is it that we're doing things? What is our motivation? I'm working so hard. I'm killing myself. I'm waking up at 3 a.m. with cold sweats because I'm so stressed about things at work. Why? What is the plot? And it's really interesting how that emerged in my practice. And I'm sure, William, you see this with your clients as well. A while ago, I started noticing that people who were north of about 45, so somewhere between 45 to late 50s, even early 60s, were coming to me. These are very successful CEOs, C-suite
Mm.
executives, university presidents, clearly by external markers doing phenomenally well and successful.
Yeah.
They have the title, they have the homes, the second homes, the third homes, all that stuff. And they're coming to me saying, this is what I thought success looked like. This is what I've worked so hard to achieve. I now have it, and I don't feel successful. I feel empty. Is this all there is? And they've
Yeah.
lost that plot. So the pitfall they've fallen into in chasing these outward measures of success is forgetting what gives them true fulfillment.
Is that where we go back into the work of Linsky and Heifetz then is that they have these universal themes of loss or fears. I remember reading that and it was like fears like abandonment or loss of identity or meaning or purpose or even death, but that death could be like death of corporate life as we know. Who am I without that identity piece? Isn't there something there that we all have these natural fears anyways, they're core to us, and then it's like what was all this for anyways, what was the purpose of this?
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a dual thing.
Mm,
In adaptive leadership for Heifetz and Linsky, they talk about people don't resist change, they resist loss.
yeah.
And that resistance happens when the sense of loss is greater than the sense of purpose. So going back to your point about scarcity mindset, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, it's all loss. It's all loss. It's a zero-sum game. And so I hold on tighter and I put on more and more pressure on myself and others. One of the tools in the book is called a joy line, which is simply a vertical line that is chronologically sequenced. And on one side of the line, write down all the things that have given you less joy, that have resulted in loss, that have resulted in scarcity. And on the other side of the line, write down all the things. And by the way, when I say all the things, choose about 10 things. The 10 things that have given you high joy, peak experiences, really motivating, you've savored it, they're meaningful anchors in your life. When you do that, then you look at, okay, am I getting propelled just by fear and scarcity? Or am I getting propelled by joy, abundance, meaning, significance? Simply doing that exercise and listing these things often is revelatory for people. But you can take it a step further and start looking at what's common to these things, what's thematic about them, so that you can understand your own imprint on life to help you inform the blueprint for the next several years.
I got a quote from the book and I loved this. So you quoted the Zen monk Suzuki Roshi, and it says, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the experts, there are few." So you talk about this in the book where people are convinced that their viewpoint is the viewpoint. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I loved reading that because that's another trap we fall into. It's the viewpoint.
Yes, and this trap of the singular story
Mm,
that this this point of view, this perspective is the perspective. It's not even perspective, it becomes fact, it becomes gospel. The higher up you go on the chain, the more likely this is to happen for two reasons. First, because you are successful, you are usually right a lot. You didn't get to where you were by being wrong all the time. So you have this proven and often rewarded and revered track record of being right. So your story becomes the story. And second, because of that power gap, no one is going to tell you
yeah.
alternate perspectives or if your story is incomplete or flawed. So we become dogmatized in that singular story. I recently worked with somebody who had written a really nice paper for his organization to set the vision, to set the course 5 years ago. And it is a textbook case. I could teach a class on how to communicate vision with this paper. The problem is 5 years later, it's outdated. We're in a world that doesn't have a playbook right now. It's very, very different. So as I started to work with this team, I was talking to his chief of staff and somebody else on the team, and I said, we need to go talk to John about this document, and that people are clinging on to this document now, but this is done. We need a version 2. And that version 2 may not even be a document because things are changing so fast. It needs to come from more people than just John. And it was like I had said something really taboo. They were like, oh no, John's really fond of that document. We cannot touch that. We cannot go near that. That is the danger of a singular story, is John and his team are likely to miss how to survive, let alone thrive in the world that we have now.
And what I like about the book, then you offer coaching questions, or in this specific case, it's clues that you're stuck in a singular story. So one of the points you make is are you particularly defensive or righteous? So, signaled by physical cues, like flared nostrils, clenched fists. You've lost your curiosity about others' ideas or perspectives, and then you're met with silence from your team. And you've so much on that. But then you were talking about communication then, and there's fault lines then when it comes to communication, isn't there?
The second most common thing that people complain about for their managers is around
Yeah,
communication. The first one being that they have a hard impact on me, they have a hard impact on other people. There's so many things in communication that it is the longest chapter of my book. There are 7 communication fault lines. So everything from your nonverbal cues, and I often tell my clients, arrange your face before you go to
yeah,
a meeting so that your
yeah,
face is in sync with the message you're trying to convey.
yeah.
So everything from nonverbal cues to talking too much to making assumptions about other people's capabilities and mindsets. So there's a whole bunch of things packed into how can we be more mindful about communication. But if you were to say, out of that big chapter and out of 7 communication fault lines, Sabina, what's the one thing managers should do? It would be to exercise what's called your shut up muscle, which is to just speak a lot less, because there's a lot of wisdom in the room that's getting drowned out every time your voice and your singular story come out to play. Now, what does that mean to exercise your shut up muscle? What if you were the third or fourth person to speak instead of the first? What if you took notes about those brilliant ideas you want to pop out and interrupt other people? What if you took notes of that and then shared only what others haven't shared later on? What if you were to recognize your interruption triggers? When am I most likely to interrupt other people? And put yourself on mute. So exercising that shut up muscle would be the single biggest thing around the communication fault lines.
And I love the personal mapping tool that you have. So, for example, you put down the personal coordinate and the effect and action. So, for example, I lose steam or I lose patience by late afternoon. And this is kind of that mapping tool. It's kind of like this is how you navigate me. Is that my understanding of this? So, this is an exercise you can do with your direct reports, with your peers. It's a brilliant one to say, listen, here's what you need to know about me, and here's how to handle me. Is that my general understanding
That
of
is
that?
exactly it. You've nailed it, William. That is exactly it. So we love to make up stories about what the person in position of power is thinking, specifically what they're thinking about us. And using the mapping tool is really helpful. For example, for one of my clients who's not a morning person, and
Yeah.
this person was convinced that he hated her. It's like, no, he doesn't hate you. He's just not sentient before his second cup of venti Americano. And
Yeah.
so it's to say, hey, I'm not a morning person. Don't talk to me before 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
Don't schedule me in important meetings before that. Or I lose steam in the afternoon. So
Yeah.
do talk to me in the morning. Or
Yeah.
frowning is my thinking face. I have a severe face
Yeah.
when I'm thinking. It
Yeah.
has nothing to do with what you just presented. I'm just
Yeah.
thinking. So I've done this with countless C-suite teams in
Mm.
offsites. And one of the offsites, these people were a pretty close-knit team, and they had
Yeah.
worked with each other for about a decade.
Mm.
Suddenly they realized that one of the people who they thought was just kind of didn't have great people skills and was at worst a jerk
Yeah.
because he didn't,
Yeah.
connect with people as much. He revealed that he had a condition where he couldn't read people's faces. He couldn't see and recognize people's faces, even his own
Yeah.
partners and his
Wow.
children.
Yeah.
Every single morning he had to start from scratch. And I said, how do you even then go through the day calling somebody by name? He said, I start to figure out what they're wearing that day, and then I latch on to that. So, of course, he wasn't warm and effusive. He didn't know who you were. Now, it took them a decade to figure that out.
Wow.
And once they did, it transformed the relationship.
And I do a similar exercise, and I think it's so powerful because people get a different insight into you. Also, they're giving you permission, and you're giving yourself permission to be vulnerable. And also, they're saying, instead of getting stuck, this is
Yeah.
how we actually move forward in a very
Yes.
productive and healthy way. And this is where we're
Yes.
not making assumptions. And this is where we're actually forging greater bonds and trust with each other to say, listen, if I'm frowning at you, this is my concentration phase.
Absolutely. And you are making yourself vulnerable, but the problem is people are making you vulnerable behind your back the whole time anyhow. They're
Mm.
making up 5 different stories about why you're frowning or why
Yeah.
you're not engaging in the afternoon so well.
Yeah.
Do you want them to have those versions, or would you rather tell them what your version of the story is?
Now, speaking of stories, that I'm going to segue into that with the myth of being exceptional. And I have to say, the amount of sticky notes I have in this book, but this one has a massive sticky note on it. We conflate excellence with being exceptional. Can you tell us about that? I was
Mm.
just going, this is brilliant.
As we rise up, look, we are in an age, and maybe that age has always been there, of hero worship, hero culture,
Yeah.
celebrity culture. And this is why I also don't like the fact of that we call someone a good boss, we call someone a bad boss. There are no absolutes. They all reside within us.
Mm.
And the more successful we get, the more people think we're perfect.
Yeah.
We can do no wrong. And the problem is we start to think that. We
Mm.
get cushioned from the criticism. We get given the private jet, the corner office, the special
Yeah.
perks. And pretty soon we start to believe we deserve it all. We're entitled to it. And that entitlement ultimately leads to be feeling like I'm exceptional because I'm excellent. And we conflate those two terms. And that then leads to, I mean, the press is littered with stories of corporate misbehavior gone wrong, way over the top, when it's too late. Because again, of course, nobody is telling us, and we are feeling like we deserve to
Yeah.
take a bigger and bigger piece of the pie.
And I just got a quote from the book. Excellent is producing great work. Exceptional, however, is believing the rules don't apply to
Apply.
you. And then you were talking about those unethical behaviors that are fed there. And that's from the organization psychologist Merit Wedelsberg.
Wedelsberg.
So it's that omnipotence, this culture numbness, and justified neglect.
Yes, our feeling that we're omnipotent, we can get away with all this,
Yeah,
and this cultural numbness of we've the people around you've gotten so used to it, it's increased by inches, so they haven't noticed it, sort of like the boiling frog water
yeah,
thing,
yeah.
and then the justified neglect is, well, I don't want to stick my neck out and put my job on the line to
Mm,
call it out, so I don't.
yeah, okay. Fascinating. There's something that really struck a note with me is unmanaged pressure. I've never heard that term before. And it really struck a chord there that when we get into a management position, the pressure is really on. And then if we don't manage it, then, and you make the difference then between pressure and stress. So can you just tell us about unmanaged pressure then and what that might look like? And
Mhm.
if I'm listening in, I'm driving the car, going for my walk, what might that look like?
Yeah, it's unmanaged pressure is stress. Stress is
Mm,
our internal response to
yeah,
external pressure. And
yeah,
that can look different ways to different people, but a lot of it is we start to get more busy and we neglect self-care. Self-care, I talk to the CEOs I coach, is part of your job description, and it's not number 17 in the list, it's number 1 on the list.
yeah,
Self-care. So it's about that. It's also about when you're under pressure, the most important thing is to do nothing. Do nothing. Because most of us do too much. And we're doing the
yeah,
wrong things when we're doing too much.
yeah,
So, this practice of blank space, where you step back, you allocate 2 hours a week to step back and unplug, no conversations, no internet,
yeah.
no reading, just step back and think about the bigger picture. It can help you get back to managing that pressure, to recognizing I'm bent around the axle for small things that don't really matter.
I'm just going to add to that because I love this line from page 199. Your role as the boss is to be the chef, not the line cook. I was like, NB, bring this up in the podcast because that thing happens, doesn't it? Is the temptation is to overfunction, as you were saying before, at the
Absolutely.
whack-a-mole, go back into what makes me feel comfortable. It's the survival instinct inside us, as you talk about in the book.
Yes.
And really what it is just to step back here and say, listen, I am I am the person overseeing this to make sure
Yes.
everybody performs at their best
Yes.
and we get the
Yes.
best product.
And you might julienne those carrots just beautifully and better than
Yeah.
any chef on the any cook on the
Yeah.
line. But
Yeah.
how are they going to start to learn how to julienne those carrots if you're always hovering over them and doing it for them? It'd be the
Good.
equivalent of continuing to push the bicycle that your kid is learning when your kid is 25.
Yeah, that great example there. And, and this is where you bring us into the time portfolio.
Mm,
So you talk about the time fairy, the pixie dust, the overnight elves, expecting these things will happen. where um, we tend to be overly ambitious with our time, don't we?
We do. And we have this magical thinking, hence
Yeah,
pixies and elves and
yeah,
fairies, is we think, oh, yeah, I'm going to get this all done and work out and spend time with my family. The time portfolio helps you see in cold reality where your
mm,
time is going and how to adjust it and be strategic about it. It's
yeah,
no different than managing any other portfolio.
yeah,
Understand what are the big chunks where you spend your time at work. So it could be managing your team, it could be time you spend for your manager, their staff meeting,
mm,
the conversations, the discussions, reviews you need to have with them. Maybe you spend time with the outside world and conferences and talks. So, what are the time on email and communications? What are those
yeah.
big chunks where you spend time? Roughly what percentage of time do you spend in each of them? By the way, that needs to add up to 100. Many of my clients start to add up to 120. And there your magical thinking comes in. Now think about where do you need to reduce or increase time? For example, let's say you're spending 30% of your time on emails and communication and you want that to become 20%. So write those down.
Mm,
Then the biggest mistake would be to try to go from 30 to 20% right away.
yeah,
Instead, have an intermediate column that is very tiny, very incremental. So could you go from 20%, 30% to 28%? And
yeah.
what's the next step for that? Maybe you just start by turning off all notifications so you're less distracted. So that's the time portfolio, is really thinking in big clumps and being strategic about how you go from here to your desired state in tiny, tiny increments.
And that's going back to earlier on in the book when you're talking about those micro habits, just for our listeners there as well, is it's that you're putting in
Exactly.
little things at a time, and that
Exactly.
you're building in that system. And here's the thing is, because I was talking to Francis Fry about this in the podcast before when we are talking about change management, and what I like about this in the book, it's on page 219, is you break out the categories down into and the current percentages and the future percentages there. And sometimes people actually don't put in strategic planning at all into their week, or new ideas for innovation, or industry socializing, or even managing my team. And you have 20% down for strategic planning. and
Yes.
and that for me is I say this over and over again to my clients and the people that I coach, is how much time you're spending on strategy.
Yes.
And it
Yes.
seems to be something that happens in fits and bursts every
Yes.
6 months or something like that. And I'm
Yes.
like, okay, let's talk
Yes.
about that. Can you
Yes.
share your insights on that?
Yes, because strategy is something that evolves every single day, especially in the world we find ourselves in right now.
Yeah,
So, how about practicing strategy with a small s instead of strategy with a big S, where
yeah,
you bring in a huge consulting firm? There's nothing wrong with that, but you have this massive offsite and then it becomes flip chartware and you don't do
yeah,
anything with it and it gets stale. So, what if you were spending ongoing time in strategic planning, baking in key questions in meetings that we're zooming out instead
yeah,
of again doing all the details which you need to do, but in the context of that bigger strategy. So what
yeah,
about on a day-to-day basis, on a meeting-to-meeting basis, what are two strategic questions you're going to ask in each meeting? Could it be about the competitive landscape? Could it be about
mm,
changes in market forces?
yeah.
Whatever it might be.
I'd like to return to the power gap distortion. So, in the book, you talk about how one way we might see ourselves and express ourselves as direct. How might be that seen by someone else due to this distortion?
Yes, yes, this is such an important point. And one of the
Yeah,
reasons that getting promoted can be the riskiest time in your career, because the
yeah,
thing that is a strength of yours is distorted and seen in a whole different way, and usually less charitably by the next that are craning up. So let's say you're direct, it's going to show up as you're being callous, uncaring, because they don't know that the direct is actually trying to help prepare you for an even more direct conversation out there.
So if I come across as confident, then how might that come across?
As confident,
Yeah.
As arrogant.
Strategic?
Oh, this is one of my favorite ones. Strategic comes across as manipulative.
Okay. Let me go on. Say, for example, I'm very detailed orientated.
Yes, of course. Then you're very micromanaging.
Well, for example, if I'm determined.
Determined, stubborn, inflexible.
What about disciplined?
Disciplined would be rigid and not open to other people's opinions.
Okay, we're going good here. What about being very focused? How about that one?
Very focused, not curious.
Okay, and maybe calm. How about that one? That sounds like a good one.
Oh, yeah, calm is another one of my favorite ones. It can come across as uncaring, aloof, distant.
Okay. So this is where the 360 then at the very end of the book is really important. And what I love about this is you have 42 questions, as I said earlier on in the podcast there. And some of the questions there, you talk about the power gaps, like the singular story, the fault lines that we talked about. But one of them is you're met with silence from your team and you're wondering why no one offers ideas or
Yes,
solutions.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly,
Or
exactly.
for example, is you don't have the team's full attention when you speak. What do you think is going on there? Like, so for those two, so we'll say, for
Mm,
example, I noticed that's a one, and I do your self-assessment, and I scored one here, very
mm.
low. If I'm concerned here, how should I treat these questions in the book?
So first of all, where you score low gives you insight into a specific power gap or a
Yeah,
specific pressure pitfall because
yeah,
there's several of them. It's a book, so there's a lot
yeah,
of them. You're
yeah,
not going to go address everything, nor should you.
yeah,
So pick
yeah,
one that's scoring the lowest and pick one that's scoring the highest.
yeah,
Do more of what's scoring the highest. Be even more creative in doing those things. And then the
yeah,
lowest one, choose a tool to offset that. Is it a shut up muscle that you need to exercise? Do you need to do a time portfolio
yeah,
exercise? So the tools that we have just talked about. Do you need to, if you're in one of those power gap distortions, let's say you're calm and people are
yeah,
thinking you're disinterested, show them how you do care. You might use the scaling tool. You might use numbers which say, look, this is how excited I get. This is my excited voice. It's still very even keel. It doesn't rise in volume. But on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm at an 11 right now. I think that this work you have done is phenomenal. Thank you so much. Now somebody doesn't read that as a 2, they know that it means an 11 to you.
okay,
So take one of the lower scoring items and apply an antidote, apply a tool to it. Here's the other thing is it's a way to raise your self-awareness because again, we've talked a lot about authority and power here, William. People
mm,
won't tell you the truth. So this is a way to raise your awareness. Now you cannot just listen to your own story. You cannot
yeah,
just do this question. Now you do need feedback. The challenge is how do you get feedback? And the quality of the feedback you receive is directly proportional to the quality of the questions you ask. So here are 3 things for that. Don't
mm,
ask questions of reassurance. How did I do?
yes,
Who in their right mind is going to say, boss, you really sucked at that? They're going to go, you did great,
yeah,
lovely, funny,
yeah,
smart, witty, so
yeah,
incisive. So if you're looking for reassurance, great. That's one of your hungers talking. But if you're truly looking for feedback, make your question specific and make it small, manageable. Don't
mm,
ask them to give you 15 pieces of feedback. What's one thing I did that worked well in that presentation? And what's one thing if I did more of or less of would have made that go even better? So we're making it really concrete. It's harder for them to wiggle out of it and just give you reassurance.
yeah,
If that is too hard for them, make it third person. So say, hey, I know you said it went great. And so you're one of my fans. I imagine this is what my
yeah,
fans would say. And if there was somebody who was a really crusty critic sitting in the audience, what do you think
yeah,
they would have said? What's
yeah,
one thing they would have said? So now again, you're asking very specific questions, but you're helping release them from any fear and obligation of taking it on themselves.
They are some wonderful insights, Sabina. And if people were to find out more about this fabulous book, You're the Boss, Become the Manager You Want to Be and Others Need, how might they do so, or how might they find more about you, Sabina?
Thank you. Well, the book is available everywhere books are sold. People could go to my website, sabinanawaz.com, and sign up for my Substack called Pressure Proof. And so you'll continue to receive tools and techniques. You can also download bonuses from the book as you go through the book, and then you can have those to run your own assessments and design the tool to suit your needs to manage power and pressure.
Sabina, thank you so much for joining the Workplace Podcast.
Thank you very much, William.
Thanks so much for listening to the Workplace Podcast. I really appreciate you being part of the conversation. If you found value in today's episode and want to support what we're building here, you'll find a link to our Patreon in the description. As a workplace expert, I'm here to help you resolve your workplace dilemmas. If your organization could benefit from my expertise, feel free to get in touch via our website, yellowwood.ie. Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner. Take a different path to success in your career, leadership, team, and organization. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you soon.